guys, and welcome to another F1 2020 video. And today we are going to be talking about setups, because that's the thing that's going to give you a better car overall, better speed both in the corners and in the straights, more stability so you can be more consistent, and better tire wear. So that's why you really want to have a good setup, and to have a good setup that suits your driving style, you really have to understand it. And today I'm going to be trying to explain when you should change things in your setup. For example, firstly, aerodynamics. This is going to affect your car in the most ways. Clearly, this game is still not a simulator, so it's still a bit easier to find the right balance in your setup, but you still have to think a lot about it. Now, let's see. I'm in Australia, but you can look at really any track, and the main thing you want to look at is how much am I spending in a straight compared to low speed corners, and then you can decide if you want to set up with lower wings or maybe higher wings. Now, mainly you want to have a setup with a higher rear wing, because in this game you have really good downforce in the fast corners, but you have understeer in the slow corners. And if you have a high rear wing, then you can adjust the rest of your setup to rotate the car a bit better in those low speed corners, and you won't lose too much time on the high speed ones. So that's one thing you have to look at when you build your setup. Of course, every time you build it, you have to adjust it to the circuit. And here you want to have a setup where you still have good front straight line speed, but you can also turn really good in these low speed corners. And for example, a track like this, you spend lots of time on the straights, but on a track like Monaco or the Hungaroring, you really don't spend that much time on the straights. So you can go for a higher wing setup, because you always want a bit more downforce. But in a track like that, you won't spend that much time on the straights, so you can sacrifice the top speed to have better cornering speed. Now, next up is going to be transmission or differential. You typically want to be running around a 50% on throttle. That's going to be the setting that you can adjust on your MFD, and that's going to rotate the car again in the slow speed corners. And typically that's what everyone runs on this game, to have better rotation, but this can change as people get used to the game and get better at it. And now for the off throttle, you want to adjust this when you feel like you can't really accelerate out of these low speed corners, which we managed to turn the car, but then when we wanted to accelerate, it didn't feel good. You spun many times, so then you want to be lowering this setting to have a more unlocked off throttle differential, and that's going to give better exits, but that's going to give you less traction. So the higher you go, the more difficult will it be to drive. But if you get it right, you get a big reward. But I don't really recommend 100% or really anything higher than 70%. Of course, if you feel like you're really good in the traction, then you can go for that. But I'd rather run around 65 to 60 on most tracks. Then going on to suspension geometry. This is going to be a setup which on last year's game and I think on this year's game is going to be really similar on every track. It's going to be right, left. You want to have the camber maximum to the right and the throw maximum to the left. Maybe because these low toes will give you a more stable car mid corner, and the higher toe will give you a more responsive car. So your entries will be better, but you won't be able to really control the car. And it's really the opposite in the camber, that's going to make up for your aggressive camber, I think, really. But you can run one or two ticks to the right on the toe, or you can basically run anything which you feel comfortable with. But this is going to give you the most stable and fast car on most tracks in the dry conditions. Now, when it comes to front suspension, this is a default setup, and the default setup really gives you a understeer setup because it has lower rear suspension than front suspension. Usually you are softer. Usually to have better rotation, again in the low speed corners, you want to have a high firm rear suspension and about a 4 difference, but it's not in the exact number. This is what I ran the most. Again, in the anti-roll bar, I think this basically has the same effect, but with less drastic changes. And of course, the higher you go on the front, the more stable will the car be, but it will be understeery. As I said before, the stock setup is really understeery on this game. And now coming on to ride height, this is you want to be running a low ride height on most tracks in the dry conditions. In the wet, you want to have the max number or somewhere around that. In real life, ride height makes a big difference because, again, the cars generate lots of downforce on the floor of the car, and you can see a higher rake angle like what Red Bull does is going to be more aggressive. It's going to be a bit more unstable, but in this game you can run about a 2-3 ride height and it will be still good on the curbs most of the time. Again, you want to run the suspension a bit softer so you can really abuse the curbs. But what I wanted to say that coming back to this aerodynamics, we had these around 3.8 or something like that. and we did that so we have great stability on the rear. And now, as we sacrificed our rear wing, we had a really high rear wing, and that's going to give us the opportunity to really have a setup on this suspension that's going to give us more rotation in these slow speed corners, which otherwise we wouldn't have had with a lower rear wing, because we couldn't have run such aggressive suspension and anti-roll bar setups. So that's another really good thing. Now, coming on to the brakes. On this game, the setups are the stock setups are all have 100% brake pressure, and if you're used to that already, then I think you should leave it like that. But you should also move the brake bias to 50%, because in this year's game the rear of the car will still be stable on these settings, and this is going to give you more stopping power on the engine brake side of things, because the energy recovery system is what's going to slow the car down even more to recover the energy. But if you feel that your car has an unstable rear under braking, then you can put this up around 54 or 53 or even higher, but that's going to have a higher chance of locking up on the front. Now, going on to the tire pressures. In the race, you mostly want to be running low tire pressures, and most of the time you want to be running lower rear tire pressures, again to have better traction, so we can use the suspension in our advantage in rotating the car. So basically that's how you should be running the lower rear tire pressure to have more stability. And again, looking at the track, every time you are adjusting something on your setup, look at the track, think about which corners you feel the car is unstable, and then which point in the corner you feel the car is unstable. So that's how you want to be adjusting the setup. And as you can see, if you again look at the track and see, okay, it's going clockwise, then it's going to have more right hand corners than left ones, and that's going to give because if you're turning right, the outside tires will have more load on them. So for example, in a clockwise track which has more right corners, you want to have higher left tire pressures than right tire pressures, but it's mainly in the high speed corners where it's going to really affect your car. Now, I wanted to say, so if you feel like you're good enough in the high speed corners, you can maybe lower these wings a bit. So I just wanted general tips on if a car is behaving strangely, what you should be adjusting. So I think it's not a strange behavior, but if you think your car has enough downforce, then of course you have to be adjusting these elements of your setup. Or if you feel your car is a bit unstable on the rear, on the corners, then you want to be lowering your rear suspension or your anti-roll bar. But most of the time you still want to look at it so it has more higher, firmer rear than the front. So let's say, for example, you you had too much oversteer in the high speed corners, so you want to adjust these settings, but you keep in mind, don't really go higher than this, because then you have lots of understeer in the slow speed corners. Brakes, well, if you lock up too much, maybe think about lowering your brake pressure, but be aware that maybe then you have to readjust your braking points. And tire pressure is really going to affect you on the race. You want to have lower tire pressures so your tires won't overheat during the race. And yeah, that's basically it. Now the question is how you are going to build a setup. Well, you can go at it and say, well, I know the track, I'm going to try this, and you make a base setup and then go out on track and again collect the data. You can really feel it through a force feedback wheel. So if you have that, it's going to give you an advantage over others, because you can feel the car a bit more and where you are feeling understeer or oversteer, and then you want to be adjusting your setup depending on how you felt it is. If you still felt it is a bit understeery, then, as I said, you want to adjust these things, or the aerodynamics of the car, or lower the on throttle setting. If your car is behaving a bit strange on the exit of the corners, then you maybe want to be thinking on lowering the off throttle differential, or go for a minimum toe or a maximum camber, because that's going to give you a more stable car. And now the other thing you can do is download someone's setup. Like, PC is full of hackers, but as we all know, Rasmussen isn't a hacker, so you can just load his setup and drive a few laps with it. As you can see, he is also using this about right, left, but he adjusted a bit on the camber, and you can see he is using this big gap in his suspension as well. He's maybe using a bit higher ride height than what I was expecting, and again 50 on the brake bias, and relatively, or the lowest tire pressure you want to have, and 60 is his off throttle and 50 is his on throttle, as I said so. And if you don't feel comfortable with this, you can try other setups, or you can adjust it the way I said setups work. And yeah, I hope this video was helpful and you guys enjoyed it, and it will make you a better driver and find that extra tenth or second that you needed, because setups usually give you around half a second to a second on a track, and that's really going to show on your race pace. And yes, I think you became a better driver. I hope you became a better driver after watching this. And if you find it helpful, hit the like button and subscribe for more videos. And I see you in the next one.